Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCS Round 1 overview, analysis, and then previews at the end for the upcoming series. We've got a lot to cover in this video. It's going to be a good one. We're going to be covering all 4 series in the first round of the LCS playoffs. Yes, all 4. That means upper bracket round 1 and lower bracket round 1 in this video because they all happened within the same weekend. I'm very excited to go over it with you guys. I hope you are as well. There's a lot of fun stuff to kind of go and talk about in this video. Some upsets, that I'm excited to get into. So if you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. This video is going to be a little bit different than maybe some of the other playoff videos that come even later in the LCS and maybe in some of the other regions because we are getting through a few more series per video, and at least in round 1 for the LCS. So we're going to be going series by series instead of game by game. If I went game by game for 4 series, it would be a 4-hour long video, and I just don't think that that is what you guys are looking for. So I will just be covering the 4 series, pretty similar to what I did with the NACL if you guys are familiar with that. But let me know what you guys thought of these games down in the comment section below. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, the LCS playoffs are kind of placed in a weird way, I would say, where top 4 teams make upper bracket, and then 5 and 6 are immediately in lower bracket. So essentially, if you're in the top 4, you get an extra life. If you're in the bottom 2, you are starting on hard mode. That is really how it works out, but everything else is still the same. So, winners will go and play in winners finals, and losers will have another chance in losers bracket. But we're going to go ahead and cover the winners round 1 first. We're going to be covering these in chronological order, and that means kicking us off with our 2 versus 3 matchup. This was probably the matchup in round 1 I was the most excited to see take place because these 2 teams are incredibly interesting, and that was FlyQuest taking on 100 Thieves. This matchup is very interesting on paper. Of course, FlyQuest kind of dominating the regular season for most of the year, but really faltering down the stretch. They have, in my opinion, the MVP of the split in Prince. They have a couple of first-team All-Pros, in my opinion, in Spica and Vikla as well. Impact, one of the better top laners. Ayla still trying to find his way on the team, but something has just not gelled for this team. I think a lot of it has been their early game. It's really taken a step back in recent weeks, and I think that's been a little bit of an issue, but obviously, the talent on this team is never going to be the problem. You're never going to worry about that too much. But you contrast that with the team that they're going against in 100 Thieves, who is almost the polar opposites in every way. 100 Thieves, in particular, has been awesome towards the end of the split. They're on like a 7-game win streak. If you count the tiebreakers that got them to the number 3 seed in the first place, they were out of the playoffs going into the final week of the season. They end up with the 3rd seed. That's pretty incredible, and a lot of their players have really stepped up recently, especially Doublelift. And that was my matchup of the series, Prince versus Doublelift, the MVP versus somebody who has really stepped up in recent weeks. It's definitely going to be interesting, but every matchup in this series is going to be important. If 100 Thieves can get to that style of game that they are comfortable with, which is, scaling into the late game, that's what they like to do. They don't like to play for early aggression. They like to try and make plays using their macro in the mid to late game, and if they can do that, I think that they're going to be in a pretty good spot in this series. If FlyQuest pushes the tempo, if they're able to generate large leads, it's going to be kind of difficult for 100 Thieves to fight their way back. So, what ended up happening? Well, the winner of the series between FlyQuest and 100 Thieves was FlyQuest. They are able to take the series in a pretty dominant 3-0 sweep, if I'm being entirely honest. This wasn't particularly close, basically at any point. And that's kind of surprising to me, if I'm being honest with you. Like I said, I thought 100 Thieves was going to, at the very least, put up a fight in this series. I actually predicted them to be able to win this series. Now, I didn't predict them to beat FlyQuest later on in the bracket because I thought FlyQuest, all they really needed was momentum and confidence, but they got that momentum and confidence much before I expected them to because they were great in this series. Player of the series was honestly kind of a difficult call because there were 3 players on this team that really stood out, that really played at an incredibly high level. But my player of the series is going to go to Spica in the jungle. It just felt like he controlled the entire game, all 3 games, 1, 2, and 3. He was the first name I wrote down in my notes in basically all 3 of them, and that's how impressive he was. The Wukong in games 1 and 2, very, very good, taking closer off of that pick. We'll get into pick ban in a bit because, FlyQuest, I think, really capitalized on some of 100 Thieves' weaknesses when it comes to maybe some shallow champion pools on some of their players, most notably banning out Lee Sin, banning out Viego for closer, and then banning out the Rakan for Busia, which is what I talked about. Teams were for sure going to target the Rakan, and then the Lee and Viego taken off the board for closer as well means that he's pushed down quite a bit, especially if you take away the Wukong, which is kind of the other pick that he has played a lot of in 2023. It's a really, really difficult proposition for Closer to find something that he has gotten comfortable on. Remember, he didn't have a particularly good regular season up until that 7-game win streak where he felt like he finally started to find his groove, or teams really started to kind of lax a bit on banning out some of his more signature picks. But, Spica and FlyQuest were definitely prepared, and they went for him in this game. And the 2 games of Wukong were awesome, being able to generate early leads. And even the Maokai, Maokai into Wukong is not a matchup where you should be able to dominate early, but Spica's just so much better, quite frankly, at jungle pathing and being able to create his own advantage that he was just a monster in this series. I thought it was a pretty easy call to give Spica the player of the series just for the pure dominance that he showed, but a lot of people are going to give it to Vikla in the mid lane, rightfully so. I mean, look at that stat line, 23, 5, and 20. I saw a lot of comments online about, where was this Vikla in the regular season? He was there. I mean, this isn't an unprecedented performance from him. He just put it together in a, 3 games in a row, which is not something he particularly did in the regular season, but he had some phenomenal games in the regular season. I saw a lot of Vikla slander, especially if you go on Reddit. They hate him. They've picked him as the player that they don't like. They find one player typically to dislike in each region. Vikla seems to be the one in the LCS. Completely undeserved, in my opinion. I thought he was the best mid laner in the LCS in 2023. Certainly exerted the most pressure of any mid laner. He was pushed forward the most. He had by far the highest forward percentage, and he was doing a lot with that, forward percentage, moving around the map, helping his jungler. And that was kind of the case here. He made Veigar look ridiculously OP. I think it was yesterday in the LPL video where I was talking about how nobody in Pro has made Veigar look dominant. Well, here you go. Vikla made Veigar look dominant. Big shock. The other player that looked really good in this series was Impact in the top lane. He brutalized Tenacity in this matchup. I know it doesn't necessarily show in the stat lines, 7, 7, and 17 is not that great, and 2, 9, and 11 isn't all that bad, but this was not close. Impact was dominant in Game 2. On the Cassante, some of those team fight ultimates were so huge, and just Cassante in general being that monster in team fights is massive. And then in Game 3 as well, I thought Impact was phenomenal, but kind of the thread that ties them all together was Spica. Prince and Alo were fine as well. I didn't think they were all that good in the early game, but that's not really where they wanted to spend their resources, which is kind of insane for me, right? Prince is your MVP, he's the one you played through all season long. You didn't really give him a lot of attention this game. You were kind of letting Doublelift gain a lot of gold because Closer was investing a lot into the bot lane and trying to get that Jinx online, and, we'll talk about it. Doublelift did get a lot of gold, he just wasn't able to do anything with it, so kind of wild that Fly was willing to play such a bot lane weak side role in this series, but it absolutely worked out because topside was a huge win for FlyQuest just in general, and it was a big reason why they were able to propel their way to a victory here. As for 100 Thieves on the other side, like I said, their saving grace this series was Doublelift. He tried his absolute best to try and win these games, but there was only so much he could do. I thought he was kind of poor in game number 1, especially his positioning towards the back half of the game, but, even the deaths in games 2 and 3, I don't think you can blame on him too much. He was pretty far ahead, especially in game 2. He was all the gold on the side of 100 Thieves, and unfortunately, look at the comp on the side of FlyQuest. If you get a Wukong diving on top of you, if you get a Taliyah that ults so you can't escape, if you get a Cassante, diving on top of you, it's very difficult to actually deal damage in a lot of these fights, and that was the problem Doublelift was running into. His team just did not peel for him in any facet, which is unfortunate considering the comp, especially in Game 2, is a Protect the Jinx comp. You just have to protect her, and they just failed to do that. But my dud of the series is kind of an encapsulation of that. It's gonna go to Closer in the jungle. This felt like early season Closer. This felt like, oh, he's been found out. You take him off the Lee, you take him off the Viego, you take him off the things that he's felt comfortable on, and he resorts to what? Xin Zhao? It's okay in the meta, it's playable, but it's not particularly strong, and then when he finally does get the Wukong, his mental is already shattered. Spica feels really confident going for the Maokai because he knows he's just gonna be able to beat him early anyways, and Closer's just useless. He doesn't really accomplish anything in any of these games. I would argue that, he was the worst player in all 3 games, which is not a particularly good feat. Tenacity was definitely in the conversation for me as well. Got absolutely bodied by Impact in a lot of these matchups. The top gap was really, really big. But really, there's only so much that, Closer could do to not get it in this series because he really was kind of bad. Bjergsen Zillion didn't really do much. He was failing to press Revive on his super fed AD carry. I don't know what's going on there. He plays Ori, he plays Ari. None of them are really working out. 100 Thieves honestly looked kind of inept in this series, which is frustrating because this is a team that really was looking fantastic going into this series. This very much felt like a 100 Thieves that is resorting back to a lot of the tendencies they showed over the middle of the split when they lost 5 or 6 games in a row, and that's not a good sign. They have to get their head on straight because their week is not over. Because they lost the series, they have to go now play in round 1 losers, and that is certainly never going to be an easy game. And so 100 Thieves losing this, they're still talented. I thought Doublelift and Busio were good, especially in lane, but really didn't do anything outside of lane, especially Busio, who wasn't helping Doublelift at all. But the top side of the map absolutely needs needs to improve. If you can get back onto the track that they were on, in week 9 or week 8 or whatever, right, the final week of the season, that is a really good place to be, and it's basically going to be necessary to compete with any of these other playoff teams. As for FlyQuest on the other side, really nice win for them. Obviously, it's always going to be big to get yourself into winners finals after one series, but to do it in such a dominant fashion, that especially is going to be a major positive for FlyQuest. Spica's looking awesome, definitely proving me a little bit right in that first team All-Pro debate. He was really, really good in this series. Vikla looked phenomenal. He definitely proved me right here. Impact looking great. Prince and Ayla being weak side is massive. I mean, if you do give them resources, they are still going to perform, and so FlyQuest looks to be, for now, relatively back on track, and that makes every team in the league a target, because when they're at their best, it's going to be very difficult to take them down. And then moving on to our second series of the upper bracket here, and this one was also incredibly interesting. Maybe not quite as close on paper, but these two teams always play each other incredibly tough. We had the number 1 seeded Cloud9 taking on the number 4 seeded Counter Logic Gaming. Incredibly excited to see this. C9 has looked so good in recent weeks. Eminence coming into the team has clearly unlocked a different level for them, just in general, because now they have 3 winning lanes in almost every single matchup that they go into in the LCS, and that's very difficult for other teams to deal with. Now, one thing that I was a little bit worried about was maybe some of the over-aggressive tendencies that this team could potentially show, and quite frankly, they have shown a tendency to be over-aggressive, most specifically Eminence in the mid lane, but there is way too much talent on this team to overlook them. They've been in relatively good form, and even though CLG was able to take the game the last time they played, I'm not entirely sure they should be favorites going into this one, but they do have some players that I think are generally underrated by the community. Dokla in the top lane had a really good split, won a couple of games for them on some aggressive fighters. Palafox has just been generally underrated for basically the last year. He's been an incredibly solid mid laner at the LCS level, one of the more consistent ones that we have seen, especially at a position that really has struggled to produce high-end talent. And I think Luger and Poom are just generally good. Contracts has been fine, even if I do think that he has not necessarily been the other jungler that some other people say he is. I still think that CLG is an incredibly competitive team, and like I said, they always play Cloud9 tough, so it's not going to be an easy series for either team, but the winner of this series and the final series in upper bracket was Cloud9. Not really a huge shocker to see C9 come out on top here, but this was a relatively close series. It was kind of back and forth. CLG certainly held their own. It wasn't a complete blowout. I would say this series was significantly closer than what we got out of FlyQuest and 100 Thieves in the series before this, but C9 still getting the job done. They win games 1, 3, and 4. They do drop game 2. We'll get into that in a bit, but on the side of C9, there were a couple of good options for player of the series. Again, when you go, 3, 4 games, it's very rare that one player is obviously going to be the best in all of those. It is just very difficult for one player to dominate a series like that, and that's the case here where there wasn't one player that dominated, but I'm actually going to give my player of the series to someone who I've historically maybe talked a little bit lower on than he deserves, and that's going to be Sven in the support position. I do really like Sven. I don't want it to come across like I don't. I know I probably have seemed like I'm lower on him on this channel, and like I've said, like, oh, maybe he can only play the enchanters. There's nothing really wrong with having your own playstyle. I do think that he has shown that he has the ability to play things like Alistar in terms of engagers. He's not perfect on them, but enchanters are good right now, so you might as well play them, and he is very versatile on the types of enchanters that he's able to play, but mostly what he's getting this player of the series for is that Game 4 on Renata. I don't think they win Game 4 nearly as easily if not for Sven. I know a lot of people are going to get player of the series to Berserker, and I totally get it. Games 3 and 4 were really good for him on the Zeri. Once he got on this late game carry that he could really do a lot with in these team fights, he kind of unlocked a little bit. Luger wasn't quite as efficient in the early game, and so Berserker did get online and was able to do a lot, kind of similar to what Luger was able to do in game number 2, but I think Sven's going to get criminally underrated for how well he played this series. The Soraka game in game 3, great. I've already talked about this, at length, I believe in my LPL video, but basically every time Soraka's picked in pro play, it does really well. I very rarely see a Soraka actively not be super positive. It's really just, sometimes Trimby picks it in situations that are a little bit too over-aggressive in the LEC, but Sven pulling it out here in game 3, super useful, and the Renata, like I said, was the key piece in that game number 4. Those ultimates really stopped the Zeri from being able to reset, from being able to really do anything. It stopped the Rakan from being able to go in. Those ultimates are just absolutely massive for shutting down CLG, especially in these enclosed-off team fights around dragons and things like that. And so really well done by Sven. In my opinion, he absolutely deserves the player of the series in this one, but Berserker also deserves a lot of the credit. Like I said, his late game ability to deal damage on the Zeri was a key factor towards being able to win some of these close games, especially game number 3 and game number 1 on the Varus. Those arrows were hurting, but another player that I think is not going to get nearly enough credit for how well he played this series again, maybe because of the stat line, is going to be Eminus in the mid lane. I was very close to giving player of the series to Eminus. He was the player who I think made the most flash plays in this series, and for good reason. Like Yone in game 1, some of those ultimates, especially towards the back half of the game, were phenomenal. The Jace Shock Blast in game 3, CLG had no idea how to deal with the poke. In my opinion, he was the player of the game in that game 3. He was setting up objectives better than Blabber ever was. No offense, he wasn't playing bad, but just, you know, those Shock Blasts just gave so much control over to CLG. It poked out basically the entire front line, or to C9, I should say. It poked out the entire front line of CLG and really made it impossible for them to fight. And then in game 4 on the LeBlanc, he was still doing a lot of damage going in and out. Obviously, LeBlanc is a champion that Eminus is relatively well known for, and he played it incredibly well. I think he is going to get underrated. He was the better mid laner in this series, and I think it was by a considerable margin. I think top side of the map definitely had some question marks. Blabber certainly had some good moments in this series, and for the most part, playing Maokai, your job is to go in, CC, and die. Like, that, I'm okay, you know, with him having 14 deaths or whatever in this series for that, but it felt like Contracts actually had a lot of pressure in the early games. I know you're kind of trading off a lot of that pressure because you're going something like Maokai into something like Elise or Wukong or, you know, whatever they were ending up playing at that time, but I think Blabber could have done a little bit more in the early game to kind of solidify stuff for C9. Overall, it wasn't an awful series. And then Fudge was generally good with the exception of game 2 where he was really bad on the Kennen, but outside of that, everybody on C9 really did hold their own end up of the weight, I should say. But Sven and Berserker and Eminus are definitely the standouts in my opinion, and they are the ones that I'm going to be focusing most on in the next round. As for CLG on the other side, they played this team tough. It certainly wasn't a roll over and die kind of game. Game 1 was super back and forth up until finally C9's able to get that, I believe it was Soul, and just kind of end the game from there. Maybe it was Elder. You guys will remind me in the comment section below. I don't actually have it listed here in my notes. But then game number 2 was a huge win for them. They actually played it super well. Palafox with those Shock Blasts on the Jace was super impressive. This is one of the picks that he has done really well on. I know NA Jace is a little bit of a meme, but Palafox really does play like Palo Faker when he gets that Jace. It's an incredibly impressive performance coming out from him. Contracts had some great pressure in the early game, and Luger, man, how aggressive was he playing? I mean, in a good way, right? Like, I talked about this in my LPL video. I've talked about this all year long, but I love aggressive ADCs. To be one of the best AD carries in your region, you've got to be able to be the one that wants to go out there and make the plays happen. You can't just kind of be a passenger. And Luger, a big reason why I've always liked him and why I've spoken so highly of him on this channel over the past year is because he's not a passenger. He's someone who is going to go out there, take some risks, and oftentimes, you know, get the reward from a lot of those. And he definitely did that in game 2. He went into that final fight at like 40% HP and just kited perfectly on the Zeri, was able to do so much damage and win the game. Unfortunately, they weren't able to really translate that into games 3 and 4. He was pretty bad in game 3 on the Jinx, was not able to get an early lead at all going into the Zeri, and just did no damage in the back half of the game. And then game 4, it's just really difficult. He had to use all of his abilities on Xayah to be able to peel himself off of the enemy team, and even then, he really wasn't able to deal out a lot of damage. A lot of times, he was looking for this perfect, like, ult-E combo that just was never going to come off, and he would end up timing out his ultimate, and it just would never be all that good, and so some good things from CLG, but overall, just not a perfect performance. My dud of the series is going to go to Palafox in the mid lane. I certainly don't think he was awful. I actually really liked his game 2 on the Jace. Like I said, those Shock Blasts were great, but I think especially in the back 2 games of the series, he was very much outclassed by Eminus, and probably the most noticeable outclassing on the team. I actually think everybody else had moments where they were like, oh, you know, they're at least in this. Like, Luger was doing no damage in game 3, but there's only so much you can do as an ADC. Poom was having moments, he was holding all his shit on Lulu to wait for the Kennen to go in that game 2, which was massive, and then in game 3, he played really well. In game 4, he wasn't so good, but you know, Dokla was on tanks, and I actually thought he was doing a good job in the top lane matchup. Contracts had some very good early games this series. It was really just down to Palafox. Like, I feel bad he wasn't particularly awful in this series or anything like that, but CLG was not really all that bad in this series. It was definitely a difficult choice to decide a dud of the series, but overall, that means CLG is now moving down to losers bracket, or, you know, a lower bracket, whatever you want to call it, and they definitely have some questions to answer for. I still think this team is pretty close to where I expected them to be, but I actually got the format of the playoffs wrong, and so they're actually going to have a tougher test, and I, you know, in that video predicted them to lose that tougher test, and so it'll be interesting to see if we can get a good version of CLG, or if the version that we all thought going into into playoffs, this good team, but maybe not a great team, is the one that's going to show up. As for C9, they punched their ticket to winners finals. They're done for the week. That means next week they're going to be taking on FlyQuest. I'll preview that matchup later on in the video, but they look so good right now. If bot side's really going to be stepping up, Blabber and Fudge had a little bit of an off day, like compared to their norms, but if this is an off day, if they're going to be able to dominate like this on an off day, then what can they do when things go right? Like Cloud9 looks genuinely unstoppable, very similar to FlyQuest. It's really going to be about which team shows up on that given day, and I, for one, cannot wait to see that matchup in a best of 5. But now we get to move on to our final 2 series of the video and our lower bracket series. The first series were important, obviously, because you wanted to get that momentum under your belt, but losing it didn't knock you out of the playoffs. You still had that extra life that I talked about being in the upper bracket, but from this point onwards, if you lose, you are done. So you cannot lose in either of these 2 series, and that is especially pertinent because none of the teams left are easily beatable. Definitely not pushovers by any stretch of the imagination. So let's go ahead and go over our first matchup, and it's a matchup between the 3-seeded 100 Thieves and the 6-seeded Golden Guardians. So 100 Thieves losing to FlyQuest in a pretty dominating fashion. It felt like they kind of got found out. Like, they had their playstyle that they really went to towards the back half of the season, which was, scaling. It was playing a hyper carry ADC with some supportive pieces around him and just kind of trying to get double lift to that point where he could win the game for your team. But FlyQuest did a really good job pushing the advantage in the early game, especially in the jungle matchup, being able to take closer off of a lot of the things that he felt comfortable with. Same thing for Busio, never getting his recon. Bjergsen in a similar vein, not really being all that much of a factor. It's going to be interesting to see if those kinds of mentality shifts translate to this series, but Golden Guardians as a team has really been struggling as of late. This is a team that has really fallen off. I mean, at points, they were looking like a top 2, top 3 team in the LCS. That has certainly not been the case over recent memory. I think they are the worst team in the playoffs, or that's what I thought going into the playoffs, and it's going to be interesting to see if they blow away that expectation by picking up a series win here. But we're going to go ahead and find out, because the winner of this series and the team moving on to round 2 is Golden Guardians. Are you kidding me? They're able to pick up the series win here. I did not. I repeat, I did not see this one coming. I know Golden Guardians is a team that a lot of people had high hopes for, especially because Gory's really good and Stixxay has been having a career year, and Huhi has proven everybody wrong, and River's a lot of fun to watch, but Golden Guardians was not the favorites in this series. I don't care what you say about 100 Thieves, kind of getting found out, having their strategy be known. Golden Guardians winning this is a pretty big upset, and it's huge for their franchise to essentially, guarantee them in top 4 in the LCS this split, potentially even higher than that. It went 5 games. It was pretty back and forth. The games that 100 Thieves won, they deserved to win. A lot of people online are going to be like, oh, Golden Guardians lost in draft because they gave 100 Thieves the things that they wanted, but it really isn't that simple. You still have to go out and execute on it, and this is still a team that struggles to win in the early parts of the game unless Closer does have one of those performances where he plays well. And so even though they got some of the things that they wanted, they still had to actually get to the point in the game where they could use the things that they wanted to use. They did play well in those, but Golden Guardians was just better across the majority of the series, especially games 4 and 5, which are obviously the most crucial in this series. Now, player of the series was actually a pretty easy decision here. I think there are going to be some people that want to give it to a couple of other people, but for me, player of the series is going to go to Licorice in the top lane, and you don't know how excited and happy I am to say that. This was the best Licorice that we have seen in years, and it's not particularly close. I do indeed think this is the best Licorice that we have seen since Cloud9. He wasn't like this on FlyQuest. He's had some good moments on Golden Guardians, especially that first split he came over. I thought he was pretty solid, but he's kind of been the weak link of the team in 2023. He had a really bad start to the year, and he never really was given a lot of pressure. The team definitely didn't want to play for him in the top side, and so even when he would play some of these more aggressive picks, it wouldn't necessarily work out. And even in this series, game 1 for Licorice was absolutely miserable. That was one of the worst games that he has played all split long on the Renekton. He got absolutely torched by Tenacity in lane. Closer did a really good job capitalizing on the mistakes that the Renekton was making, and I was like, oh no, here we go. Licorice is going to be the weak link that cost Golden Guardians the series. But then Game 4 and Game 5 happened. The Olaf in Game 4, absolutely massive. He was unkillable towards the back half of that game. He was dealing so much damage and causing so many problems for 100 Thieves that they really just could not overcome. And then the Gwen in Game 5. I know a lot of people are going to be looking at the Zeri in Game 5, rightfully so. We'll get to Stixxay in a second, but Licorice played that really well in that same vein. He was super aggressive, he was playing on the edge of danger, and he knew exactly when he could go all in on somebody else. You know, Gwen's one of those champions that can still do a ridiculous amount of damage, and that's what he was able to do. Top lane's a weak role, a worthless role. Not in this series it wasn't. Licorice was incredibly important in the two most important games in the series, and that's why he's going to get player of the series. I think you could give an overall player of the series score to somebody in the bot lane, most notably Huhi for me. I feel like he's going to go under the radar for how good he was in this series, but he was awesome in their wins. That game 2 game on Nami, that game 4 game on Nami. Lucian Nami was just generally positive for Golden Guardians, but the Blitzcrank in game 5, it really showed to be incredibly important. Busio had a phenomenal Blitzcrank game in game 3 to be able to, you know, basically get player of the game and a win for 100 Thieves, but that pick showed its importance on the other side as well, as they didn't really have a lot of good answers to it on the side of 100 Thieves, and they ended up just losing the game because of it. Sion couldn't really tank it because if he got pulled in, he was going to get blown up by the Gwen, and nobody else on the team really particularly wants to get pulled in. I mean, maybe other than the Wukong if he doesn't get perma-CC'd, but there really just aren't a lot of answers to the Blitzcrank on the side of 100 Thieves, and Huhi played it well, but he was just generally great throughout the whole series. He's been generally great throughout the whole year. Stixxay was also awesome, most specifically in game 5. I do want to point that out. The rest of the series, he was good. Game 2 was really good from them. The Lucian Nami really was positive in that game 2, but I would say, you know, Stixxay's definite standout moment was the amount of damage that he was able to do towards the back half of game number 5 to really seal the deal for Golden Guardians, but Licorice, Stixxay, and Huhi being the 3 to step up, and they win the series. Now, that's exactly what Golden Guardians fans wanted to see. A lot of the narrative surrounding this team has been River and Gory, for obvious reasons, because it feels like they really have elevated a lot of the talent around them. So to see them kind of be the weak links and everybody else in the team kind of step up and carry, it's just been a majorly positive showing, I would say, overall for Golden Guardians. Huhi proving me right for putting him first team All-Pro in the support position, Licorice having probably his best series of the year, and Stixxay continuing to look really, really good. Golden Guardians was a lot of fun in this series, and they deserve to be in the top 4. As for 100 Thieves on the other side, disastrous collapse. It felt like they finally got found out. You know, a lot of the strategies that they were going towards the back half of the split, just not working anymore. A lot of the scaling in the bot lane, Jinx, Jinx, Zeri, Zeri, Jinx, right? That's the kind of style you wanted to play for. You're seeing a lot of supportive mids, a lot of tanks top, and then whatever closer can get his hands on that he is comfortable with. And unfortunately, for 100 Thieves, Golden Guardians had it scouted, and they were ready to play into that. Now, that's not to say they should have gone to something else. I know a lot of people on the internet are really pissed off at 100 Thieves because it was same comp after same comp after same comp, but we've said it 1,000 times, not only on this channel, but I hear you guys saying it 1,000 times. If you're good at something, play it. Like, if you are good, if your best play style is a particular style, play that. You know, try to get the game to come to you. You don't want to try to play into your opponents. Unfortunately for 100 Thieves, it just wasn't going to work out in this instance. My dud of the series is going to go to Tenacity in the top lane. He got shoved on tanks basically the whole series, and quite frankly, he just wasn't very good on them. The Gragas in particular, he just was horrendous on. It was just not a very good look for him. The Sion, it was probably his worst series on that champion all split. The Cassante was alright in game number 1. Certainly don't have any major issues with that, but Tenacity definitely showed some weakness here in the playoffs. Got bounced by Impact in their matchup, got bounced by Licorice in their matchup. Really didn't look all that good in either series, and that's something to keep in mind. I still like Tenacity's upside, but he was always a carry-oriented player, and being shoved on tanks and, you know, having to play that weak side role because Closer doesn't know how to play towards topside, it's just not something that I think brings out the best in him. So that's something to keep in mind. But also, like, Closer and Bjerg were also not good in this series. There really is no takeaway from that. Closer, especially when he wasn't on Viego or Wukong or whatever, you know, whatever one of his, you know, main 3 champions he ends up getting, looked bad. And the Vi games were just horrendous. There is no excusing how bad he plays on that champion. If you can't play it, don't pick it, because that's one of those champions that especially you need to generate early leads on, and he just wasn't able to do that in any game, and I don't really think Vi fits 100 Thieves playstyle really at all either. It's basically like picking like an Elise or a Lee Sin or something like that. I don't think it really brings out the best in what this team actually wants to do. Bjergsen was kind of off this series. I mean, the Victor, Annie, Talia stuff, whatever. It was fine. It wasn't like a game breaking. It wasn't game losing, but he also wasn't doing all that much. But the Zillions, like, I would have expected a lot more. He was ulting bad targets. I mean, ulting a full HP Gragas in game 4, ulting your support, like, it's just weird. I'm not sure if he's missing the click or whatever it was, but it wasn't a particularly good showing. I would say Doublelift and Busio were really the only 2 players on 100 Thieves to really step up throughout the consistent part of the full series. Closer was good, I would say, in their wins, but he was horrendous in their losses. Doublelift was pretty solid this series, but obviously playing hyper carry 80 carries, you're not always going to look good, and especially in that game 2 where his early game was just atrociously bad. It's worth pointing out. Busio was awesome in Game 3 on the Blitzcrank, but outside of that, he was just kind of meh. I still think he was probably the best performing member of 100 Thieves in this series, which is a good sign because he's one of your big upcoming young supports, but I think a lot of people are going to give him a lot of shit, you know, for the Thresh gameplay and not being able to play maybe something a little bit more, you know, Enchanter-oriented to kind of help out Doublelift. But it's just the style that this team likes to go. I don't even think it's really a Busio problem. I think it's more of a 100 Thieves problem, so overall, they've got a lot of things to fix moving into summer, or at least a lot of things to consider. This team very much had that one play style. It's going to be interesting to see if they lock that in, if they really become that late game scaling team, and that's just the identity that they want to have for the rest of the year, or if they want to use this time to explore new options. You've got plenty of time with MSI and everything to figure out what the hell is going on, but your split ends here. As for Golden Guardians, again, they move on, which is massive. This team is not, you know, stacked on paper in the same way that, you know, FlyQuest or Cloud9 is, but clearly they have a little bit of the X factor, and we're going to have to throw out a lot of the tape that we saw in the final week of the season because this team really did play like a team possessed in the playoffs, and that's exactly what we wanted to see. And then moving on to our final series of the video, our second lower bracket series, and the second team to officially be eliminated to be determined here. And this one was really intriguing. I didn't actually profile it in my pre-playoff, my playoff primer video, but I did talk about it a little bit because I did get the way the format works wrong, obviously. But let's go ahead and talk about it here. I'll give my thoughts a bit on what I was thinking going into the series. In the preview here, we had the number 4 seeded counter, Logic Gaming, taking on the number 5 seeded Evil Geniuses. EG falling down to the lower bracket after a miserable final week of the regular season. They were a team that was pretty consistently in the top 3 throughout the majority of the regular season, if not almost all of it, but obviously having a really bad week where you go 0-4, including your tiebreaker game, is just not super conducive to you finishing well in the regular season when it matters the most. Obviously, they were sick that week. They were playing from home. There were clearly a lot of things going wrong with the team, but it is worth noting that, you know, they're not in the best of form going into this series, and CLG, on the other hand, actually competed a bit with a really good Cloud9 team, and this is a team that took a game off of Cloud9, not only in the playoffs, but they beat them in the regular season in that final week as well, and they went 3-0, and they were really starting to feel good, and so there are some positives to look at for CLG in the series. However, I predicted EG. And I can say that confidently because you can go listen to my playoff primer video and you can hear me talk about the matchup in case I was wrong. I said I actually think EG would end up beating CLG were they to play, so EG was definitely my favorite in this series, but CLG is not a pushover by any means. This Evil Geniuses team is much too talented to be going out in round 1, but crazier things have certainly happened. We've already seen a really good team in 100 Thieves be eliminated. Will we see another in Evil Geniuses, or will it be CLG going out like more people predict? Well, the winner of this series, and moving on to round 2, is Evil Geniuses. They are able to get the job done here in 3. It's not even really all that close. This is a sweep. The only game that's kind of close, I would say games 2 and 3 both had moments where they were close, but both of them were really big early game leads from Evil Geniuses where they just couldn't hold on in the mid game. That's a little bit of a trend for this team. But either way, they were still able to close out the games. This very much felt like a vintage Evil Geniuses performance, exactly what they showed off in the regular season. Some really fantastic play in the early goings of these games, especially Inspired in the jungle. In that game 1, he was just beautiful. He absolutely obliterated Contracts in that first game. Games 2 and 3 were a little bit more, I guess, even in the early game, but still Inspired did a great job being able to generate gold leads super consistently for Evil Geniuses throughout basically every lane, most notably mid and bot, the 2 lanes that this team has invested the most in across the season. That certainly didn't change in this series at all, and while they did have their struggles in the mid game, games 2 and 3, CLG actually had some moments. You know, they were able to win some fights around like 3rd Dragon in game 2, and then, you know, in a similar spot in game 3, Evil Geniuses were still able to take control of the series. They were able to take the reins, and they were able to close it out. I think player of the series was a little bit up in the air for me, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to Jojo Pune in the mid lane, which is just a really good sign. Jojo is someone that obviously is ridiculously talented. He's the heart and soul of Evil Geniuses. When you think about this team, he is going to be the first player you think about. But on the flip side, he's been very hit or miss over the course of the season. He's only, I believe, the 4th player in LCS history to be worth over 30% of his team's deaths. a wild statistic, but one that definitely tracks if you've been following a lot of the things that I've said about JoJo over the course of the year. He's been very aggressive, but a lot of times that aggression has come back to bite him. Luckily, in this series, he was a lot more contained. This was a very different performance coming out from the mid laner. He was probably the most different from his regular season performance to his playoff performance because he was actually playing really calculated and really, I don't want to say cautious, it's not the word to use, but he wasn't taking massive risks. He wasn't going out on a limb to try to make a lot of these plays. He was just playing really well. He was playing really, really contained and really only making good plays. He was beating up Palafox in basically every game except for game number 3 and create a lot on the map for his team. Him and Inspired were a great duo. They have impacted the bot lane very efficiently in all 3 games. It was just a great series from JoJo. If he continues to play like this was summer 2022 JoJo for me. This is like post-MSI JoJo, which is a really good sign because it felt like he was reverting to a lot of his spring 2022 tendencies where he was that player that was really talented, but maybe just a little bit over-aggressive, maybe not entirely there yet. This was a great showing that kind of proves to me that at the very least when games matter, maybe he's willing to lock in just a tad bit more, and he definitely showed that off in this series. But like I said, Inspired was also really good. FBI and Vulcan were phenomenal in this series. They're going to get overlooked. Vulcan in particular was sensational. I don't know which player on CLG talked trash to him on Twitter, but usually he only plays like this in series where he has a personal rivalry with somebody. So it's really good to see him be able to pull out such an amazing performance. The Ashe in game 2 was awesome. I mean, legit like player of the game worthy. And then the Thresh in game 3 was also great. The Rakan in game 1 was great. He didn't have a single not great game in this series, and that's a really good sign. FBI continues to be maybe the most underrated player in the LCS. He's just been consistently very good over the course of the whole year. In my opinion, he's probably been the best player on this Evil Geniuses team in 2023, but, Inspired and Vulcan were also really, really good. I just think FBI was probably the player that carried them the most, especially in the late game in these situations where they are giving away quite a bit of gold. Yes, he can get a little bit over-aggressive stepping up, and there are times where he's not going to look entirely good doing that, but for the most part, he was doing a ridiculous amount of damage, and he was by far the better AD carry in this series. And so, JoJo, FBI, Vulcan, Inspired looking good. Someday was important because he played the Malphite in the first 2 games, but outside of that, his gameplay really wasn't all that, exceptional. It's top lane, right? It's going to happen every once in a while. In most series, not counting the last one, top lane's just not going to matter all that much. And that was kind of the case here. Evil Geniuses was really solid, though. Not a lot of negatives to give out, to be quite honest. As for CLG on the other side, not a lot of positives to give out, if I'm being quite honest. There really wasn't a lot of things that I could point to being like, yes, that was very good. I think Palafox had a great game 3 on the Jace. I think Poom had some good engages on Rakan. And that's about it. That's really all the positives that I can give. Contracts did not have a good series. Dokla was put on tanks. Basically, all of his losses this split have been on Sion. I don't know why they continue to give him that instead of something he can play a little bit more aggressive on in the top side because that was a strategy they really liked. And then my dud of the series was an absolute no-brainer in this one. It's going to go to Luger in the bot lane. He was abysmal. This was one of the worst AD carry performances we've seen in a while. He was playing aggressive, and, if you follow this channel, you'll know I'm pretty positive when AD carries play aggressive. I like to see them go out and try to make plays, but this wasn't aggressive. This was inting, right? This was, just mispositioning, being way too far forward, getting caught out, not using your summoners, not using Xayah ultimate. There was just so many things that he didn't do in this series. And honestly, it must have been a confidence thing. It must have been mental because this is not the Luger that we got in the regular season. It just wasn't. I'm huge on Luger. I think he's, again, kind of similar to FBI, a pretty underrated player when it comes to the LCS. Certainly one of the more consistent AD carries. And so for him to come out and just put up an absolute stinker in a winner-go-home playoff series is just very disappointing. I hate to see it. I like Luger as a player, but this was not his day at all. Basically, everything that could go wrong with the way that he plays League of Legends went wrong. And again, it's got to be a mentality thing because, playstyle-wise, he was really good this split. He was one of the big reasons why CLG was so high up in the standings is because of his consistency at winning lane, in particular down in the bottom lane. But not very good. Poom wasn't very good either. Palafox had 2 really bad games and then 1 really good game on the Jace, so that's solid. Contracts, really looks good on the Sejuani and the Maokai and these more tank-oriented junglers, but you take him off that, you put him on something that has to be a little bit more proactive in the early game, and some of his negative tendencies of being over-aggressive and maybe getting caught in situations where he shouldn't be, come back out. And then Dokla, again, stop putting him on tank, stop putting him on Sion. I understand from a draft perspective why Sion is good for this comp, but it just doesn't fit your players. Dokla needs to be on a carry, especially in a win or go home series. He was arguably your biggest carry, maybe outside of Palafox, this entire split. To see both of them not really be given the opportunity to actually win the game for their team has got to feel at least a little bit disappointing if you're a CLG fan. But overall, There are still some positives to take away from this series and from this year. I mean, CLG still outperformed what a lot of people expected them to be. I had them in 7th in my preseason power rankings. They ended up in 4th in the regular season, 5th, 6th by the time the playoff ends. And, that's acceptable. Like, you're going to be able to take that. It's about probably where they should be in terms of talent. I'm not particularly surprised about this outcome, but I know some CLG fans were expecting more. As for Evil Geniuses, this is where they should be. Top 4 should have never been a question for EG, but they did struggle towards the end of the regular season. They should be able, to continue pushing forward, you would hope. The talent on this team is just way too good to be a team that is out in bottom 2 in the playoffs, and luckily for them, they proved that in this series, but it is not over by any means. This is a team that definitely wants to be competing for top 3, and they still have their work cut out ahead of them for that. But moving on to our predictions part of this video now, we're going to quickly go over the 2 series that are going to be happening in round 2, the winners finals, and then the losers game to decide top 3. We're going to go ahead and talk about, preview what exactly is going to be going on in those series, maybe what my expectations are, key matchup, all that fun stuff. I'm going to do it relatively quickly. I don't want to take up you guys' time too much in this one, but let's go ahead and go over it, starting with winners finals, because that's the series that I think a lot of people are most interested in. We, of course, have a matchup between the number 1 seeded Cloud9 and the number 2 seeded FlyQuest, the 2 winners from winners, if you will, going up against each other. They split 1-1 in the regular season. FlyQuest dominating in the early part of the season. Cloud9 striking back in the second half to be able to take that number 1 seed. This is going to be a super fun series. It might not be the only time we see it in the playoffs, no matter who wins, but I'm really excited to see it nonetheless. It was really good to see FlyQuest get some momentum back by beating 100 Thieves in such convincing fashion. Cloud9, though, definitely not a team you can overlook, no matter what is going on the other side of the map. There are a lot of matchups here to look at that are incredibly interesting. Fudge versus Impact is very intriguing because Fudge is such a lane-dominant player, and Impact does struggle a bit in lane, but he is so good in team fights that he ends up being a major positive for the team. It'll be interesting to see if Cloud9 maybe wants to invest a little bit more into their top side because of that matchup in particular, or if perhaps they want to try and, take this volatile mid matchup and try and get something out of that. Eminus, Vikla, 2 players that have incredibly high highs, but have also had some low lows over the course of the split. I think Vikla has been a little bit more consistent, but mechanically, Eminus is right up there with him. I mean, this really could be a fun back and forth between 2 incredibly talented players. And then, of course, you have the bot lane matchup. Everybody's going to talk about Prince versus Berserker. It might just be the MVP debate over the course of the split here. Prince versus Berserker might be everybody's 2 top picks in terms of the MVP debate, so it's always good to see them face off in a best of 5. Berserker definitely got the better of him in the regular season, but anything can happen in a best of 5, and these 2 teams are certainly not the teams that played in the final week of the season. And then Ayla versus Sven, 2 kind of overlooked supports, I would say. Ayla not exactly had the most dominant of regular seasons since he came back, since he got his visa and was able to play, but he is incredibly talented. He was the player from the academy scene last year that I was the most confident was going to be able to translate to the LCS. And Sven has been perennially underlooked. He was awesome in their first round series, and he's a really big proponent of why Berserker has been so good. But that's going to lead us into my key matchup, and who could it be? It's the only people we haven't talked about. You guys know who it is. It's the jungle matchup. It's Blabber versus Spica, and this is really where I think the series is going to be decided. You can look back on a lot of their games, all 3 of them that they played throughout the regular season so far, and you can see that these are the 2 players that influence those games the most. You can talk about Berserker and Prince being incredibly important to these teams, but they're more microcosms of what happens in the jungle, especially when they're playing against each other, because neither has typically developed a ridiculous lead against the other in that kind of way. Berserker's done really well in lane, I do want to say that, but it's not like Prince has been bad either way, but these stats really show you how dominant both of these players have been. Blabber leads in some important categories like XP at 15 and gold per minute, while also being really good in first blood percentage and damage percentage, but Spica takes him basically across the board in almost everything else. I mean, first in first blood percentage, second in damage percentage, second in kill participation, second in gold per minute, second in KDA. Spica really did have a fantastic season, and if he's going to be able to generate the same kind of early leads that he has been able to do for FlyQuest over the course of the year, C9's going to be in trouble. This is not a team that really has had to play from behind all that much, but Blabber is certainly no pushover. He's the most talented jungler that NA has ever seen come out of the region, and he is certainly not someone who's just going to roll over and die. I think whichever jungler is able to maintain pressure in the early game more consistently is, quite frankly, probably just going to win the series. It probably is that simple, and I'm interested to see. If I had to put money on it, I don't really know, man. I would take Cloud9, but like barely. Like, this is a 3-2 series to me. Either way, one way or the other. I like both of these teams a lot, and I really could see it going either way, and I wouldn't be shocked no matter what happened. I could see Blabber and, Berserker and Eminence popping off. I could see Spica and Prince and Vikla popping off, and neither of those would really surprise me. I really hope that we do get a fun series here because both of these teams do deserve it. And then moving on to our second series, our lower bracket series, the two teams that were able to pick up wins in the lower bracket. We have the 5-seeded Evil Geniuses taking on the 6-seeded Golden Guardians, the two lowest seeds in the playoffs, being able to make it out of lower bracket and going up against each other. Definitely some intriguing matchups to look out for in this series. I think a lot of people, first of all, are going to look at the bot lane matchup, FBI versus Huhi. I'm really excited to see that. This is the first time that they've played against each other in like a high volume series. Obviously, these two teams played each other in the regular season, but to see FBI versus Huhi in a best of 5, that's going to be a lot of fun. Even like 6A versus FBI is a really intriguing matchup. Huhi and Vulcan might be the two most talented supports in the entire region, so a lot of really, really fun things to look out for there. But on the top side of the map, Someday and Licorice, two more weak side top laners that haven't exactly been a big part of their team's, quote-unquote success, but Licorice on the Renekton has been massive over the course of the season. Not so much on anything else. He was great, obviously, in the playoffs, and Someday, maybe not as efficient, but also a big Renekton player, and that's going to be interesting to see how that matchup ends up going. And then Inspired versus River, two players that have gotten a lot of success for turning around their team's macro throughout the season. But my matchup of the series, it's going to, again, be no surprise because a lot of people are going to be looking at these two. It's going to be the mid lane matchup. It's going to be Jojo Pune versus Gory in that mid lane matchup. Jojo obviously coming off of a really good series, but he's been so up and down over the course of the split. And you can see that in all the stats. He's first in GD at 15. He's almost last in KDA. Like, that just goes to show you he's 8th in damage percentage, but 2nd in damage per minute. He's doing a ridiculous amount of damage, but so is everybody else on his team. He's doing great in lane, but he's throwing away those leads with crazy positioning. There's a lot to take away from Jojo and what he's been able to do so far this split, but again, as we saw in the previous series, if you get the good version of Jojo that knows when he needs to make plays, that is still able to capitalize on his mechanical prowess and his mechanical skill that he has over a lot of his opponents, while still not, throwing all that gold lead away, that's an incredibly scary proposition to go up against. But he's going up against Gory, who, again, is a mid laner who's come into the league and really just been a mechanical force. And I think that's really what makes this interesting. Gory has not been playing to his highest level over the past few weeks. That's something I'm a little bit concerned about here. Because if Jojo is able to generate a strong lead, this series might not be all that close, no matter how well Stixay and Huhi play in the bottom lane. If Gory can't get over Jojo, if he's making mistakes that give Jojo leads and, Jojo's playing that good game, it could be a little bit of a problem. But if Gory can find that form that he had the last time that these two played, it's going to be lights out because he is incredibly dangerous when he's on his more assassin-oriented picks that he can win with. I would say that because of this key matchup, I'm definitely leaning a little bit more towards Evil Geniuses. The form that JoJo and EG in general have been in as of recent just gives me a lot more confidence than what I have in Golden Guardians, but it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility for GG to be able to pick up a win here. I didn't even expect them to be in the series against 100 Thieves, let alone win it, and so they've already proven me wrong once. I can go ahead and be proven wrong again, but if I did have to predict, I would say this is going to be an EG 3-0 or an EG 3-1. I have much more confidence in Evil Geniuses as a team right now than I do in Golden Guardians, and I think the mid lane matchup represents that well. Alright, that is going to do it for my LCS Round 1 overview and analysis of all 4 series. I really do hope you guys enjoyed the video. Of course, up on the screen is the updated bracket, but we already covered all those games. I'm really intrigued to see what's going to happen next week, but let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of the video. Did you guys enjoy it? Did you guys not? Do you like the format? Do you not? We're going to be going game by game basically from this point onwards in the LCS because we're not going to have 4 series to cover in one video, but let me know what you guys think of the best of 5 coverage, maybe being a little bit longer than the typical series, but still being a little bit shorter than the game by game in situations like this. I'd love to hear you guys' feedback down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. Really does mean a lot to me and also helps get this out to more people. And if you're new, hit subscribe. We don't only do the LCS on this channel. We cover the LEC, the LPL, the LCK, the NACL, all of those regions every single week. And with playoffs, being here basically in every single region, you're definitely going to want to hit subscribe so you can get daily updates on LoL Esports. We're posting 33 days in a row. We're right in the middle of that right now. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend you hit that subscribe button. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.